Welcome to this lecture. I'll be talking today about external validity. Overview, we'll talk about what external validity is, talk about it in terms of generalizability of particular aspects of the study, and then talk about the importance of establishing external validity through multiple studies rather than a single study. Okay, so external validity is all about generalization, right? Generalization of your findings, experimental findings, correlational findings, whatever you found in a study, how far can you generalize what you found, the truth of what you found beyond the study? Typically, we think about external validity primarily in terms of generalizability across participants, right? In terms of, okay, we have these types of people, does it generalize to other types of people? We're talking about typing people. Typically, we'll consider the important demographic variables for behavioral research, and the ones you'll always see reported when people, even if they aren't looking at these variables as subject variables in the study, they're not looking at differences in demographics. So they're going to report these demographics because people want to know, well, tell me about your sample. What was the age, average, and range? What's your gender distribution, and what's your racial or ethnic distribution, right? So those are kind of the major demographic characteristics that typically people will report, will be looking for, because we're interested to see if the findings generalize to people other than what you had in your study in terms of ages, genders, and ethnicities. Okay. Of course, there are other demographic characteristics that will be more important depending on what your study is about. Occasionally, there are unique characteristics of a sample, right? So if you happen to have, if you're looking at the experiences of first generation immigrants, okay, what are the stresses like? What are maybe some of the processes involved with acculturation and families, or interacting with different systems in a new country like schools or banks or whatever it is? Okay, well, obviously you're going to mention, well, when you're talking about these first generation immigrants, what's their culture of origin? Why did they come over? Were they seeking political asylum, or were they seeking economic opportunities? There are certain things about that group that you might want to know that may not be as relevant for other samples. Okay. So in terms of well, what types of people are we looking at? Well, it depends on the study. But external validity, generalizability, generalization is about more than just participants, right? It's also about the ability to generalize across settings, right? And that being kind of a broad term for everything else in the study, what you did. So physically, where it took place. One of the primary distinctions we look at frequently is if a study took place in a lab setting versus in the field, right? In the field doesn't mean in the pasture with a bunch of grass. It means out in the world versus in a more controlled environment. Which if a study occurs in a field setting, often it's assumed to have greater generalizability, but not necessarily, right? Depends on the degree to which that external setting, that field setting, is unique or more universal, right? So if you do a study of about cognition, okay, if we use different colored letters for words, people can remember them better. And we're going to do it in the field. Well, we're going to do it with astronauts on the space station. Okay, that's going to be some interesting research. But to what degree are your findings about memory going to generalize beyond your study if it's in this very particular field setting that's pretty unique, right? Or maybe not so much. So it's not a matter of lab settings, poor external validity, field settings, high external validity. It's just there are different things to consider if the study is occurring in a lab or in the field. If it's in the lab, to what degree is it realistic? To what degree is it kind of contrived or artificial? If it's in the field, to what degree is it kind of real world? And to what degree is that field setting unique or special versus more universal? You also want to consider external validity in terms of the manipulations, right? So if you're looking at, okay, how do people remember things when they're scared? And you scare them by playing a loud noise. Okay, is that finding about fear and memory going to be generalizable to other ways of being frightened, right? Where a loud noise, maybe there's a startle response involved that may be different than if somebody is more like watching an Alfred Hitchcock movie, right, where that suspense, that fear is building slowly over time versus a sudden, jump scare, right? So how you're manipulating variables, particular constructs, the degree to which how you did it in the study, if it's different from other ways that construct might be manipulated, okay, that might limit the external validity of your findings. Similarly, the way that dependent variables, criterion variables, even predictor variables are measured in a study may limit or increase the external validity of the findings. Okay, so we found this effect on memory when we looked at number of words remembered. Okay, well, what about if it wasn't words, it was sounds or pictures? Is it going to be the same effect? Because now you're measuring memory differently, kind of a different aspect of that construct. Time, and this can be time of day. Okay, if a study is conducted in the morning versus the evening, there may be some things related to fatigue or diet in terms of caffeine intake. Depending on what you're studying, that may be important. Seasonally, studies are taking place in the winter, summer, spring, depending on, again, the geographic setting, that may be important. That may be influencing the dependent variable. And also even broader sense of time, kind of generationally. If we find we're looking at how people feel about airport security, asking those questions in 1995 versus 2015, probably pretty different responses, right? So there's some things that change in our world. They're going to change particular constructs, behaviors, thoughts, and feelings. And so when we find an effect or a relationship at one point in time, you remember that is, to some degree, might be limited to that point in time, and it might not be true, or might be true in a different way later, and might not have been true previously. You also want to consider for all of this stuff in terms of settings, manipulations, measures, time factors, the degree to which the study has ecological validity, which isn't a synonym with external validity. They're similar, but they are different. Ecological validity has to do with the degree to which the experience of participants mirror real-world events. And again, that can be somewhat subjective, right? So if you have people that you're trying to induce some sense of paranoia by telling them that, okay, you have this task to work on, and you have the Confederate there that's seems to be watching them, trying to make sure they're not cheating. Like, oh, what's up with that? The degree to which you can make that real world, well, that's going to be different for different people. If somebody's a member of a marginalized group in the States in particular, that tends to experience more distrust from other people, their experience might be different than other people's experience, even though you're doing the exact same thing with your manipulation. So ecological validity can be a bit complicated. How important, though, is external validity, the degree to which we can generalize our findings. Well, it depends, right? And part of what it depends on is if you're asking whether some sort of relation or effect can exist or whether it does exist. If you're asking if, okay, can this variable affect this variable? Might there be an association between these variables for some people, sometimes, somewhere? If that's your question, then external validity doesn't matter. You're doing more kind of basic research. If you're doing more applied research, you want to know, you really do want to be able to make these broader statements about what people are like, what they do. So yeah, there's this effect exists in the world. Well, now external validity becomes more important. Right? Another thing to consider is the degree to which decisions are going to be made based on the findings. Right? If the government is contracting people to do some research, and based on the results of those studies or that study, they're going to make significant policy changes. Okay, external validity is pretty important, probably, right? If we're trying to figure, okay, if we have this $1 billion to spend on health education, will this health education program increase people's use of going to annual physicals, decrease their intakes of fats and sugars, all that sort of stuff? Okay, now at some point in time in research, it's important to know if it can be effective. But if you're about to spend $1 billion on this program, you want to know real world, is it going to be effective, and is it going to be effective across the U.S.? If it's going to be this kind of broad thing that everybody's going to be exposed to, well, does it work for everybody? And does it work even if we're not exactly true to how you did it in the study? How far can we go from how you did it and still be okay? That becomes much more important. You also want to think about to whom do the findings need to generalize? Right? If you're doing that study on first generation immigrants to a new country, about their experiences with acculturation, okay, would those need to generalize to people who are fifth generation immigrants or children of descendants of immigrants? No, I mean, that's a totally different question. It's not relevant to them. So everything doesn't have to be generalized to everybody. It's a matter of perspective to some degree. So a question that pops up related to this is, well, are your findings useless if you have poor external validity? So you look through and you say, oh, these people are unique, the setting is unique, the manipulation is unique. Why did somebody even do this study? It's a piece of junk. Well, no, of course not. There are many uses. Research findings can be valuable in many ways, even if they have limited external validity, provided that they have good internal validity. Right? If we're confident about the relationship between variables in an observed study, that gives us important information about those variables. We just may be cautious about drawing broad conclusions about lots of different people, different places, different points in time based on that single study. But that's okay, because again, you shouldn't try to do it all in one study, right? External validity is something that you need to consider the degree to which it's impacted by choices in a single study. But usually the goal of a study isn't to have the best external validity in the world. Usually you're trying to achieve more external validity for a theory or a set of conclusions by doing multiple studies. You do that via replication studies, and you also can get at or gauge external validity by looking at processes for summarizing and integrating findings from multiple studies. So we'll look at both of those things next. So for replication, right? Replication, repetition, repeating a study, doing it again. A couple different types. There's exact replications, where you're basically saying, oh, you found that? Oh, interesting. Find it again. Right? And there's it's always interesting whenever people fail to replicate things, right? There's the the Mozart effect, right? This finding that I can't remember how long ago it's been now, but somebody found, oh, if you're listening to classical music, it increases cognitive functioning. It was this very kind of sexy finding. You're like, oh, that's really cool, and now we got these baby Einstein videos. We're listening to Mozart and all this stuff. Yeah, my kids listen to it too. And people went and said, oh, that was very interesting, but that's weird that's that big an effect. I wonder if I can find it. And quite frequently they didn't. There was a failure to replicate. And eventually, the literature on that is settled on, okay, there is an effect, but it's limited to certain processes. It's not the same. It's not the global effect that the original authors maybe thought it was. But the exact replications are important, especially when you have kind of findings that that are kind of unexpected. They don't line up well, fit in well with everything we've done up to that point. And so here's this thing that's totally different than what you thought. You know, almost like this clickbait type thing. You won't believe your eyes. Well, maybe you shouldn't believe. Let's replicate. Let's do it again. Which kind of goes to the general attitude of science, in particular behavioral science. It's like, okay, maybe let me verify that. And so we're never going to trust a single study, a single finding. Okay, this treatment is the best treatment ever for depression. Really? Anybody else find that? Because if you're the only one saying it, maybe it was a fluke, or maybe you're lying, or maybe it worked. Let's find out. And so you might do, let's just do exactly what you did as best we can. But to do that, the authors have to provide ample detail about what they did, which is why, as you're working on your research proposals, it's so important to include an appropriate amount of detail in your method section so that somebody, if needed, could come along and replicate your study. Okay, so exact replications are interesting again, but they're used more rarely whenever there's kind of an exceptional finding. People are kind of doubtful of it. More often we see conceptual replications. Right? This is where you have the same concepts, same constructs that are being manipulated or measured, looked at again, but with different operational definitions of the measures and manipulations, right? So, okay, you found this thing where if you scare people, they remembered more of this type of word, but you use a jump scare. Okay, now I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm going to do it with more of a slow build increase of fear without that super big rush of fear. And I'm going to see if I find the same effect, right? So I'm looking at fear and memory, but in a slightly different way. And this isn't so much where you didn't trust your finding. You want to know, okay, what are the limits of this finding? How far does it generalize? Does it generalize to different operationalizations of the manipulations and measures? Right? A third type of replication study are constructive replications. And this is where you typically do either an exact replication or a conceptual replication. So again, trying to what they did before, but then let me add this piece, right? So I'm gonna scare people and look at the memory, but then I'm also gonna have maybe another factor where I'm going to give half of them cannabis before I introduce the scare to see if that changes the effect of fear on memory, right? So I want to see if there's this moderation effect where the effect of one variable is different depending on the level of another variable, if there's an interaction between these two factors, right? And again, that's a way to kind of test, okay, how far does this finding go? Is this always true? A similar approach is participant replications, right? This is where you're doing with a different group. And this is best to do if you do kind of a constructive participant replication, where you have the original group that some study found, okay, we found this effect with men. Okay, we're going to look at it again with men, but now we're also in our study going to have women as well. So we can replicate, yep, we found it with men, but look, the opposite thing happened with women. Or, yes, the exact same thing happened with women too. There was no difference associated with gender. So all these types of replication studies, what they do is they build on the external validity of findings. Either say, yep, it applies here too, or applies this way. Even when this is going on, this happens. Or they kind of set the limits of those findings. Okay, yeah, that was true, but it wasn't true when we looked at these people, or looked at it this way, or when we added this other factor, right? So there's some you're setting the boundaries of how far the truth extends. So in that way, doing these multiple studies helps you get a better idea of the external validity, the generalizability of an effect of a relationship found in a particular study. Another thing that's helpful is looking at multiple studies. So not just, hey, they did one, I'm going to do another one. Okay, let's go through and look at a whole bunch of studies. And so this is what often happens in researchers try to develop research programs where they'll get a question that they're interested in and they'll do a study and they go, oh, what if I do this now? And they do another study and they go, interesting, now what if I do this? And they build and build and they're like, wow, you published on that same topic 10 different articles. Yeah, that's what you're supposed to do because they're trying to get closer and closer to wrestling with searching for truth, right? And understanding that they can't get at the truth in one study. They can take little bites of it at a time, and hopefully each time they collect data, analyze it, and look at the results, they're getting a little closer. It's kind of like revealing the statue trapped within the marble, one hammer blow at a time. So researchers work to typically in one area repeatedly to understand the limits of an effect or relationship. And then sometimes too, people will look at other people's work and write these review articles, right, where they say, okay, here's the state of the literature on attachment, the relationship between mother-child attachment and attachment in adult romantic relationships. We reviewed these 30 studies, and here's what we know based on, so you don't have to read these, we read them for you, kind of like a book report almost, summarizing all these things. And these are often helpful things to do to catch up, especially if you aren't familiar with a particular area of research. You can start with a review article and go, oh, okay, and then you can go to those individual articles to get more in depth. Right, but you can get that a nice breadth, a nice overview with a good review article. One problem though is when you read those, you tend to they can be a little bit misleading. They can kind of underestimate the strength of an effect or relationship, because there's a tendency when you do these review articles to say, okay, well, they found this. However, there's some contradictory findings. Some people have failed to find it, or they found something slightly different. And if there's 10 studies on one side and 3 on the other, they'll still say, hey, this, but this, and they don't really weight, oh, but the evidence is much stronger here than it is here, right? Because you're not doing any kind of really quantitative analysis. It's just, again, that book report, and you're trying to give this kind of fair and balanced review of, yeah, they found this, but maybe not, right? And so even when the literature might be weighted more in one direction, you may not get a good sense of that from a review article. And that's where meta-analyses are sometimes more helpful, because they literally look at the weights of the findings, right? A couple of advantages of meta-analyses, they tend to be more objective than review articles, because they are research studies, right? Where they're not collecting data in terms of going out and bringing participants into a study or surveying participants. Their data are published findings of other people's studies. Those other people went out, collected data from participants, and then submitted to journals, got it published. Now the meta-analysis goes and gets all those articles and pulls the numbers from those, and that's their data. But one thing that makes them objective is a good meta-analysis is always going to, as part of their methodology, publish their inclusion criteria. Okay, so we did a thorough review of literature, and we included all studies that had this, a minimum sample size of 20. That measured, these 2 variables at least. And sometimes they'll say, we only looked at studies that were experimental. We didn't look at any correlation studies. Or we only looked at double-blind placebo studies. Whatever it is, they're going to say what they used as their criteria to let studies in And so then again, okay, well, whatever they're going to tell me about the literature, it's limited to this type of study. That's just like when you have inclusion-exclusion criteria for participants. Okay, well, whatever people found with this experiment, it's limited to this type of people. So again, the inclusion criteria tells you which studies it's limited to. And the other thing that helps with the objectivity is the analysis of effect sizes, right? Where effect sizes that are published in studies are measures of the size of relationship between variables that's not as heavily influenced by sample size as p-values, right? If something's statistically significant or not, that's heavily influenced by how big your sample size was. Effect sizes are not. Right? So you can look, okay, regardless if we had big studies, small studies, what size effect did they have? And it's not a simple arithmetic average, but there's a way of combining those effect sizes and coming with, okay, overall, using this therapy for this outcome, the average effect size is this, and that's small, medium, or large. But there are some drawbacks to meta-analyses too, because you're dealing usually with incomplete data, right? Because they're really only looking at published studies, and there are plenty of studies that don't get published, often like dissertations, and then often there's also a language bias where they're looking at studies published in the native language of the authors of the meta-analysis, right? If I'm doing a meta-analysis, I'm just looking at things published in English, right? But there's this whole other literature out there, in German, in Mandarin, in a variety of other languages that I'm not even going to read because they're not in English. And so that's going to, with some necessary cultural bias, when you say, okay, here's the state of the field. Well, here's the state of the field for mostly English-speaking people. And the other thing is, there's a lot of studies that aren't published or are more likely, that are out there that happened, are more likely to have null findings, right? Null findings being where they found no effect. They failed to reject the hypothesis. There's a publication bias among journals that they're just less likely to publish a study that has null findings than one that has statistically significant findings. For whatever reason, they think it's more interesting. So there's this kind of desk drawer phenomenon where we say, okay, for every study that you see published showing this effect, there may be two more in somebody's desk drawer that they looked at the same exact thing but didn't find a statistically significant effect, and they usually will have smaller effect sizes. So meta-analyses may overestimate some effects, right? Although some try to do kind of via some guesswork. They say, well, imagine if there were 200 unpublished studies that had really small effect sizes. If we average those in, the effect size would still be this big, right? So they try to deal with it mathematically sometimes. But again, it's just some guesswork. But overall, the point here is that external validity is often best elucidated, best understood, not by simply looking at a single study, but by looking at multiple studies. Okay. So, take home. It's important to consider the degree of external validity for a given study. When you're reading an article and you want to think, okay, well, how far does this apply? Is this only true for these people, or if you do it this way? If you look, particularly if you're doing a treatment study, okay, well, they did 10 sessions every week and nobody ever missed a session. Okay, is this going to work with my clients who, miss 1 out of every 3 sessions? Got to ask that question and think about the degree to which you believe the thing will still be effective once you deviate from what they did. External validity is about more than just the participants, right? It's about all those setting variables, the measurement, manipulation of variables. But then the biggest thing for me in external validity is, one study is never enough, right? And so you don't want to get too obsessed when designing your own study. Well, I've got to have the best external validity, I got to have all these different people and measure things 27 different ways. Not necessarily, right? Research is additive, one study at a time. You find something, and then you go do a replication, or you combine with other similar studies in a review article or a meta-analysis, and we build the knowledge collaboratively over time. Okay, that's all for now. Take care.